of the Monitor, still one of the leading newspapers in Uganda today. He, amongst other things, went on to start the Pan-African unit of Mail and Guardian. He has recently founded Africapedia. One of my senior colleagues, who is himself a seasoned journalist and Africa correspondent, refers to him as one of the most impressive media practitioners on the continent. I personally want to say that I think he is one of the finest intellectuals that Uganda has produced in the last few decades. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Charles Onyango Obbo.
You shouldn't believe Matthias, and the person who was talking of is Christoph. They're all my friends, so they are not objective. But I'm really glad to be here after a very long time. It's very strange. I studied at this university, and my father-in-law was the academic registrar here for very many years. So now, when I was first asked to speak, I was actually reluctant because geopolitics, or the beat of it that I have dealt with, is something which hasn't involved student audiences. So I say to myself, how do you speak about geopolitics to a student audience? And I decided we'd do maybe three things. One, Bertrand Russell says that the greatest hindrance to learning is the authority of the teacher. So I said, I'll try to avoid being like your teacher. And that perhaps the best thing is to show rather than to tell. But secondly, is that this is just one way of, the primary thing about this is one way to think about geopolitics. It's more a methodology, a kind of a pop methodology. It's not supposed to be authoritative, so it's just one way to explore the question. So initially, I was asked to speak, this is what I'm going to speak about, Africa and the world in Africa, and something which I call the Kattegat doctrine. But that was not what I was initially asked to speak on. I was asked to speak on Africa's role in geopolitics and global power play. So why did I change it to the subject which I did? And I think that it is important to reflect on what Kattegat, I think everyone here knows Kattegat. In 2011, we had a scenarios building workshop in Nairobi, done by the Society for International Development. It does this big East African and Africa scenarios work. And Kattegat said, you know, Africa is the richest continent in the world in terms of natural and mineral resources. It has 600 million hectares of uncultivated arable land, which is 60% of the global, and you know, you can see that for yourself. But then he said that Africa is really not doing anything with this. He says that 90% of the containers that come to East Africa, for example, go back empty because we produce nothing, or very little for the world. And then he says that the world can't just sit back and watch if we don't put our resources to productive use. He says that global players will come, take and do something with the resources. It is the cold reality. It is how the world works. And there was a lot of moralizing yesterday. You know, you can moralize all you need. This is how the world works. And So, if we go by the Kattegat doctrine, he would be asking things like, if Africa has the resources that are critical for the global economy, food, human, and environmental security, what is Africa doing? One, to make them productive for itself and the world. Secondly, to secure them. And that to understand Africa's place in world geopolitics, it has to be in this context. How much of those goods, international security, sustenance, environmental safety, and global economic and market provision, it supplies or doesn't. And therefore the big question, how is the world responding to our failure or success to provide these goods? Now, let me just tell you a little story, just how what really geopolitics works. In 2010, there was horrible weather around the world. And countries like Russia, the Ukraine, Australia had their lowest wheat production in 30 years. It sent the price of wheat by anything depending on markets from 35 to 70%. What happened next? Countries like Egypt and the North African countries depend, in Egypt's case, for up to 82% of its wheat imports from Russia. And the staple, the matoke and potatoes of Egypt is bread. They call it esh balad. The price of bread went up, and in North Africa. Because of bad weather causing a poor wheat harvest, prices went up in Egypt and North Africa. And if wheat prices hadn't gone up and bread prices hadn't gone up, the Arab Spring would not have happened. So, and that is how geopolitics works. Now, when food prices went up, it became an existential issue for the Middle East. And hence the second story I'll tell you. At that time, I was at Nation Media Group, so I got a call from a very rich and big media agency in the Gulf. They had just announced that they were going to start an Africa TV broadcast. And they wanted to start the first one in Kiswahili. And it was going to be based out of Nairobi. So they asked me for a meeting at the Serena Hotel. So I went and I saw them, and they said, we want you to do something with this, with us. And then I told them, I don't particularly like TV, that's one, and I'm not a TV journalist. So we spoke for a very long time, and then they left. And I traveled about a week later, we had a mission to Europe. So they called me and said, we would want to talk to you again. We were in Paris at that time. So I said, I thought we had finished this. They said, no, we want to talk to you again. Something has come up. And I told them I'm in Paris, so they came, they flew to Paris. So we met. And they said, we want you to reconsider. And I told them, but I've already given you my views. And then they told me that, Charles, this is not about TV. This is about food security. Because they said their country and other Gulf countries, after the food crisis of 2010, they had decided that their food security was in Africa. But they had tried to buy land for agriculture, and there had been popular protest. So they were doing the TV not for news. They were doing it to convince East African populations to accept foreign land leases. You may think that is good or bad, but that is how geopolitics works, and that's how countries think about geopolitics. What was the result? In many ways, the Kattegat prophecy came true. That, and that is the number at about 2015. Those are the land buys that foreign players have undertaken in Africa. Now, it is important to see that a lot of the land buys are in, one, Eastern Africa, but they are really huge, substantial land buys. So it's the 2010 crisis, the food crisis, and basically the editorial program of a major television channel all fed into this reality. Now, you've already seen the concentration on the eastern side. One of the questions you ask yourself, what else is happening? And there are many things we can talk about, but today we'll just talk about the eastern side of Africa and the Sahel. When, from an eastern perspective, in geopolitical terms, what is most important for us is what is happening in what you would call the Greater Indian Ocean Circle. And this represents the countries both along the length and breadth of the Indian Ocean, but near. And those are broadly the countries along the Indian Ocean Circle. Why is the Indian Ocean Circle important and what happens there? 80% of the world's maritime oil trade flows through three narrow passages which lead into the Indian Ocean. The Strait of, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Strait of Malacca. In all, it represents nearly 30 million barrels of oil a day. It is very important to appreciate this reality, to understand what happens in the broader Horn and Eastern Africa. The second thing about this area is there is this thing actually the idea was developed by Stratfor. It said that when China becomes a mature economy and goes into services, there will be 16 countries which will become the world's new manufacturing hubs. So they call them the PC16. And you can see that virtually all of them, except 3, are concentrated in the Indian Ocean Circle. And for the Ugandan nationalists here, you will be happy to see that we are there. And there are other things. There are 2 billion people in the Indian Ocean Circle. It's 30% of the world's population. It hosts 23 of the world's busiest ports. If you take the smaller Indian Ocean rim, it accounts for 22% of the world GDP. And it is a very, very important one for the EU, because if you look at the number there, the Western Indian Ocean, it accounts for 53% of EU tuna catches. These are just not numbers which do not have political realities. They do. Now, the other thing, and we'll bring this all together, is that we need to understand how the digital age has reshaped Africa's geopolitical standing. That is basically, the world's internet cables. And you can see that really Africa is the bridge. So if you hold such a precious internet asset, asset for the world internet age, you have certain responsibilities. And you cannot just go on as business as usual. Now, one other thing that we need to mention is If that is the reality, how are countries responding to it? You can see that China's response has been the Belt and Road Initiative. And you can see the area maps very neatly what we showed you, the assets that exist in the Indian Ocean Circle. They have taken it a bit further into Europe because in their own view, 62% of the world's population will live in that zone. Basically, if you don't live in that area, in the next 50 years, you'll be a very, very marginal force. So that is China's response. And they have good reason, because that is a map of China's major investments in the world. The bigger, the more it is. And you can see the replication of the concentration in the Indian Ocean Circle. And in African terms, you can see what's happening, how much they are concentrated in East Africa. So they really have business to invest into the security and other architecture of this, of that region. Now, that is a very, very important area. But you see, those assets came under threat. In 2011 alone, Somali piracy cost $6.9 billion in disrupted shipping. And we've already showed you the digital infrastructure. For networks like Teams, it meant that they had to take their cable 200 kilometers further away from the shore because of piracy. This was not going to stand. And people like Seacom and all those had to delay. So you begin to see how actions by essentially local actors has very, very global impact on the Indian Ocean Circle. And I think that this is a very touchy subject in Uganda. But I think that we really need to appreciate what the UPEF did. Because, we keep asking, what does Africa give the world? I think what the UPDF did when it became the first mover contingent is it actually supplied one of the biggest geopolitical goods to the world. Because what they did made it possible to begin to turn the tide in the Horn and in the western side of the Indian Ocean. And there are some things which you never think of. In a way, what happened in 2007 became very significant for the World Cup in 2010 in South Africa. You'd ask yourself why. Because the World Cup in South Africa in 2010 is the one event that drove the largest investment into fiber optic infrastructure in Africa. And you can see why that is critical on the West End, is that 2010 and the World Cup was the point at which Africa made the turn. And without the events that started in 2007 in Somalia, it would have happened, but in a very different and a very costly way. So when you ask yourself, and there was a lot, yesterday there were a lot of people who were very despondent, this Africa is not a player or something, it doesn't do anything in the world. We do. It's just that you need to look at it differently and to redefine your view of what a geopolitical property and service is. Now, this is how the big boys responded. Because of some, there are a lot more, the guys who have a lot to lose responded with military bases. That area which we showed you, has the largest concentration of foreign military bases in the world. And something else happened in the Indian Ocean as a result. It had the largest concentration of multinational and rival forces since the end of the Second World War. So everyone, Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, China, everyone moved in. But we should not just look at the Horn alone. You must look at the Horn in the bigger context of what is happening in the Sahel. Now, in 2015 at the Mail and Guardian, we did this map. And, it basically showed America's main military bases. And if you look at it, they form what you'd call a hippo trench. For those of you who are into conservation, if you go to a conservancy where there are hippos, the way you keep hippos away is that you just dig a trench. You don't have to do anything else. So hippos can't jump over a trench. So we called it the hippo trench. And we begin to ask ourselves, why is this the case? Of course, there are there are strategic issues. After we did this map, we got a call from the US, and they say, you guys have done a lot of these things. Do you actually want to see what we do? So I said, yes. So we flew over to Stuttgart, which is where AFRICOM is based. And they put on a hell of a show for us. And I think, I hate to admit this, I think I started to see the point they were making, why they needed to do this. Now, I have put a circle there because that circle, that area inside the red the red quad is the most interesting one if you are talking of geopolitics in this region. And whichever way you slice it, it keeps showing up. So, beyond just the US, if you broaden it, everyone is there. The Belgians are there, the Italians are there. Further on a bit, and a lot of people never think of this, you see India. India also plays big in the Seychelles and Madagascar. They have bases. And it is the same area. And this is not coincidence. So, and it's just not a few, the French and the Chinese. Everyone is playing there. And you have to ask yourself, why? There are many stories you can tell why that's an important circle. And even from a pure environmental point of view, that is kind of the border which defines the climate flip in Africa. The red area, the red areas are a desert and low on, on water. The lower are the greener one. And if you look at ecological asset as having economic and strategic value, you can begin to see why people should build basically trenches along it. If you slice it, this is a very interesting map. You have exactly the same formation. The battles and that is for 2017, 2018. If you look at the violence against civilians, it is still exactly the same area. If you look at riots and protests, they are concentrated in the same area. But there is also that spot there. That is, which is why this area becomes filled here because of remote violence, because they constitute what you call ungoverned spaces. Now, there was a lot of arguments, and a lot of people say that these conflicts are driven by resources. So we said, if they are driven by the resources, what does the Africa resource map look like? And it looks like that. But you can see it has no correlation with the geopolitical hot points. So it's only half the story. It can't be the full story. So then we said, what else might explain it? And a lot of people here were saying, the conflicts in Africa must be understood in terms of the interests of capital and the people who are exploiting it. So we said, let's look at what the facts and the data says. That map, for example, shows you the concentration of multinationals in Africa who work in oil. And oil is one of those notorious ones which is associated with instability. And you can see it doesn't add up. If resources and finance capital determine conflict and the sharp edge of contestation in Africa, the conflict map would look very different. So we looked at some proxy data. We said, how do you understand exploitation in Africa? And we said, let us look at illicit financial flows. The picture becomes much more complicated because Africa loses 1.29 billion a year. No, the activists say it loses. Me, I say, money leaves. I actually think that some of this here is fairly, I do believe that a company should be able to repatriate its profits. There are people who have problems with that ideologically, but I don't. But I think that it is very interesting that the second area of loss is from here. 36 billion, 36.6 is the cost of climate change crisis in Africa. And you begin, when you see that, you begin to think differently about where is really the contestation and what is it that we should be doing. So let us take this picture. Assume, for example, that this 1.2 billion is tied to fragility or can indicate where you have trouble. You then ask yourself, which are the countries where the illicit flows happen the most? And if you look at the data from 2007, none of those countries except Sudan is in the Hippo Trench. So maybe you begin to think, okay, we have to look at, okay, these things are important, but what other factors need to come together to explain all the military bases we have there, all the violence? And you begin to get into some numbers, because West Africa, every year about $2.1 billion worth of cocaine passes through West Africa. Only 40 million stays to secure the networks. All of it goes to Europe. And so you begin to see that you have all the other factors, but these are the things, and depending on how you look at it, Africa's failure, those ungoverned spaces, and the inability to control this is what explains why those areas are flashpoint. And that is basically, you could call that a map of the main criminal activities in the continent. And you see the same belt that we spoke of in the middle of Africa. It's drugs, cigarettes, extremist groups, the Al-Qaedas, and all these guys thrive in there because it is an ungoverned space. It creates a lot of the violence you see is concentrated, in that belt. So in many ways, you can say countries are active in this space not only to secure their broader economic interests, but because of the crisis of it being an ungoverned space and the range of activities, illegal activities that take place, and how much threat finance, as they call it, is accumulated. But all is not bad, you know. All is not good. This very same space we showed you to be a hot point is also the site of some of the most amazing things that are happening in this continent. And, you know, the Great Green Wall of Africa. The Great Green Wall of Africa is important because I think it just shows that we are not as hopeless as some people seem to think, and I had a lot of that yesterday, because it represents Africa's biggest supply of what you would call a global good. It will run 108,000 kilometers along the continent, and we are entitled to ask these African things. People just talk of it, things never get done. But actually things get done. And a lot of progress has been done. You know, the goal is 2030 to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land. And, you know, a number of countries have done a lot of interesting things. This is important for us. I mean, if it happens, you'll have 10 million green jobs. Young people will be taken care of. A lot of activities. Ethiopia is close to planting 4 billion trees. Senegal has done 25,000 hectares of degraded land. Even Nigeria, which never seems to do anything, has done 5 million hectares. Sudan has done 2,000. And the interesting things happening in Burkina Faso and Mali. And I consider that the Green Wall is actually Africa's contribution to world peace, to the geopolitical basket. Now, there are a lot of millennials here, and you should ask yourself, why should I care about all this stuff? You see, it's easy, like was happening yesterday, to ask other people's children to go and die in revolutions. But I want to tell you that, as you need to be looking at some of these things as an opportunity. Because the global market for what has been happening here for 2 days, if you leave this room and you are smart enough, you can get some of that, of those billions. By next year, the global market for geopolitical risk analysis, even for talking about it like this, it's a big market. It is 17 billion, and if you add other things like network security and all of that, it becomes bigger. It is 120 billion shilling, dollar market. So even if you can't go out and save the world and make Africa a better place, just study it and be smart at it and learn it, because you can actually make a living doing it. But to really, really, really get into it, I know a lot of you here are film people. I am a big, big film person. You've all watched the Bond films. This James Bond, Quantum of Wolf Warrior 2 to Timbuktu, Eye in the Sky. The thing about Wolf Warrior 2, who here has watched it? If you want to understand China, if you want to understand China's place in the world, I'll tell you, don't read a book, don't do anything. Just watch Wolf Warrior 2. and you'll be very smart and you'll impress your boyfriend and your girlfriend about how the world works. So, but it is an incredible geopolitical story. And it was the highest grossing film in China's history. You know, it's not, part of it is the old script, you know, China saving the world, beating the bad guys in Africa, the Indian Ocean, the Horn of Africa, but it just shows you how China thinks. But also, and you know, I know a lot of people here have the codes. One of the biggest growing segments of video games now exploit this geopolitical story. You know, for some reason, the world is very crazy about geopolitics. And $300 billion market by 2025. If you are not into, I don't play video games, but I study them for different reasons. But video games like Civilization and Tropical are just phenomenal. And again, if you want to understand geopolitics, just play those games. So you don't have to go to the desert or the bush to die. In the meantime, you can grow rich out of the conversation of the 2 days. And this being a film, I mean, since we are talking of film, I'm sure people here, you know, even younger people grew up on Star Wars. How many people here have watched Star Wars? Okay. All right, so we end on that. And I'll say, may the force be with you. So at this point, I sit down, I think. Good. Or question time, or what do I do? Okay.
We don't have a Q&A in the program, but I am not ready to just break into those panels now. I said something yesterday about my hope for this conference not being that, you know, so many answers and solutions will be found, but that we will learn to ask better questions. Charles, I think after this, some of the questions in my head are completely reshaping, and I'm internally already reformulating my questions I have about some of these global challenges. So we need a bit to process this. And I did just get a note from my good friend Julius Muchunguzi from the office of the Prime Minister. But Julius, I did not need that. And not just because my wife is Kenyan, but because I know the face of a man called Onyango. And not just because people are talking about his daughter now, but if you know about politics in Kenya, you know about the story and history of that man. We are very pleased to have you in our midst. And if I may, can we have a microphone? I would actually love to invite you and give us a quick comment or question on what Charles has just shared with us. Do we stay here or you sit? Or you can go down wherever you want.
Well, I am an intruder, actually. I came here yesterday to give the Milton Obote Memorial Lecture at the Sheraton, which I did. And today at breakfast at Sheraton, I saw Onyango Obbo, who told me that there was this conferences participating in the Makerere, and could we drop in? And Julius was kind enough for us to drop in and just hear what's going on. I'm glad I came because this is an area I'm completely ignorant of, and I've learned a lot in a very short time from Onyango. So I think I'll engage him when he's back in Nairobi to come and give me a tutorial on what he talks about this morning, which I'm completely at a loss to tell you the truth. Those figures look like rocket science, so I guess you can decipher them to lesser mortals like ourselves. But first I must thank the university. The hall has really improved. In our days we had plastic chairs or something less than that. There was no carpet. And the steps looked a little bit higher. Maybe they were the same, but I was a much younger man. And the atmosphere is very welcoming. I hope you get time to remove this chair sometimes and turn into a dance hall like we used to do. Dancing with girls from all kinds of training colleges around. And then we used to sit out there. Milton Obote was very fond of coming to dance with us and drink beer out there. Those were the days. And of course I remember, since I can't talk about the difficult subject that Onyango Obbo has brought in this morning, I can just give you some sweet memories about the past. I remember there was a very famous debate here that was between or among the late Professor J.P.B.M. Ouma Muga, who was Professor of Geography and a specialist in a subject called alluvial geomorphology. I don't know what still that means up to this very day, but he was an expert in that area. And then there was the famous Professor Ali Mazrui, the late Mazrui, who could hold a debate on anything under the sun and still sound very sensible. And then there was a man called Walter Rodney from Dar es Salaam. And I remember Josh Mujenya and myself, Josh was my vice president. We went to pick up Walter Rodney from University Hall, where he was staying. And on the way walking here, we asked him, but Professor, where are your notes? You know, he had a very shrill voice. He said, brothers, if it is not here, it is nowhere. So he came here, the subject was the written word and mass mobilization, because the nation was being mobilized to follow the move to the left strategy, written in the Common Man's Charter. The theme of the Common Man's Charter was to guide the misguided and inform the misinformed. So we said, well, the misguided and the misinformed must be informed by the written word, but how many Ugandans can read and write, and how are we going to inform them? So we organized as a student guild a topic to be handled by these giants. And it was great because Ali Mazrui started by saying one of the things we have to credit the colonialists with is because they brought the written word. And for that matter, without the colonialists, we would not have the instrument to mass mobilize. When Rodi came to speak, he said, yes, Ali Mazrui can say the colonialists brought the written word, but they brought exploitation. They brought oppression. They brought the domination of the common man by the big boys. And this is what we have to deal with today. Then Mazrui came back and said, Professor Rodney and I are not in conflict over this issue. I think I only said that on the one hand, the colonialists did that. On the other hand, they also did bad things. So we have to be open to both. Then Rodney came back. Professor Mazrui and I are not in conflict. We are not even in contact. And colonialism came with only one hand. There was no one hand, the other one, this, the hand of exploitation, the hand of oppression. And that's why I'm not in conflict with Professor Mazrui. So we clapped and enjoyed, and I was moderating. So when I came to speak, I somehow managed to moderate between the two. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Continue moderating this important discussion. I don't think I'm in conflict to Onyango Obbo over this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. What an opening we have today. And what an honor to have somebody like Peter Onyango give a spontaneous remark. And we all know, I think everybody in East Africa knows, he's a political heavyweight in the truest sense. So thank you for joining us. Maybe you can come back next year for Geopolitics 2020, and we will invite you as a keynote speaker, as a panelist. We'll be happy to welcome you again. We want to follow the same procedure we did yesterday. I explained the concept of the academic quarter, where if the time for a lecture is 11, you add 15 minutes for people to find their way there and be seated. Now, for those who feel like, oh no, but we still want to engage Charles Onyango Obbo, he'll be with us the whole of today. He will be part of one of the panel discussions, and it's about the Red Sea arena. So I think some of the issues from the keynote may also play a role there, and there'll be sufficient time to engage him there. I just want to give a reminder. I hope you all have the program, but just a quick logistical remark and organizational remark. We have, for those of you who just came today and weren't here yesterday, we have 3 parallel panel venues. One panel will be here in the main hall. Another panel is, as you leave this hall, turn to your right, to the corridor on the right, and at the end there's the senior common room. And just outside here, you can either now move out quickly from here or go around the other side. We have our SDG-themed tent. Those are the three venues. For those of you who want to explore the question of whether machines are taking over, stay in this main hall. It's about what robotics and AI are doing to us as human beings, how we work, how we think, and how this technology changes our societies. If you want to talk more about Africa, and especially the question of African unity, will there ever be something like the United States of Africa? Then you are welcome to join us in the senior common room. And if you want to look a bit closer at what is happening in conflict, and you've seen the graphics here, we are right in the midst of an area that has a history of intense conflict. I was especially shocked by the graphics that showed the violence against civilians. And a question closely related to that is women in conflict. How are women affected by conflict? What's the role of women in conflict as victims, as active players, as peacemakers? If you're interested in that question, join us in the tent just outside here. I can already see people moving, and that's good. Let's try to lose as little time as possible so that by 11:15 we can start with the panels. Thank you all again for coming, and thank you all for being here with us, including some of the Ugandan VIPs we have here. Danchi Dega is just greeting Robert Kabushenga. Those are the kind of people we want to meet today. Thanks for coming.